Why would a hardened German soldier, a man who'd driven half-tracks and tanks across 3 countries, ask his American captor for one last favor before he surrendered? Not food, not mercy, a photograph, standing next to a jeep. It sounds almost pathetic when you say it out loud. This wasn't a tank. It wasn't armored. It didn't have a cannon. It was a boxy little runabout that looked, by every German engineering standard, like something bolted together in a single weekend. And yet, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen roads of the Ardennes, this toy kept doing something German officers swore, on paper, was impossible. It survived where heavier machines died. It adapted to jobs it was never built for, and it consistently outworked vehicles that cost 10 times as much to design and build. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why. Because buried somewhere in this story is one detail that didn't just embarrass German engineers back in 1944. It quietly went on to rewrite German vehicle design for the next 50 years. We are absolutely getting there. But first, like the German army itself, we have to start at the beginning. Confused, and more than a little insulted. German motor pool officers had been trained on the Kübelwagen, a real, considered piece of engineering, with a Porsche-derived chassis and a shape that at least looked like someone had thought about it. The Jeep had none of that. Flat stamped panels, exposed hinges, a windshield that folded down flat against the hood, almost like it was embarrassed to stand upright. Captured German technical reports from 1942 described it, more or less, as a vehicle that looked rushed into service, something built to last a season, not a war. They were wrong about that, completely wrong, because the Jeep wasn't badly designed at all. It was deliberately stripped down to absolutely nothing but the essentials, and that single design choice was about to hand the Wehrmacht a logistics headache nobody in Berlin saw coming. Because here's what happened the moment German mechanics actually had to fix one. A Kübelwagen needed specific tools, specific training, and often a part that had to come from one specific supplier. A Jeep needed 20 minutes, a length of wire, and a soldier who wasn't even particularly good with his hands. That gap wasn't luck. Willys Overland and Ford had been forced, under strict U.S. government contract, to standardize specifications across 2 competing factories, something German manufacturers, buried in constant wartime rivalry, never came close to achieving. German mechanics who serviced captured Jeeps found something that must have felt almost insulting. A part stripped off one Jeep fit perfectly onto a completely different Jeep, built in a completely different factory, sometimes an ocean away. That might sound like a small detail. Hold on to it anyway, because it's about to explain something far bigger than spare parts. Willys Overland and Ford together built somewhere around 640,000 Jeeps over the course of the war. Not a specialty vehicle, not a rare battlefield trophy. A vehicle so common that a single American infantry division could field over 1,000 of them, Jeeps and Jeep-based variants combined. A comparable German division might scrape together a few dozen light vehicles, total. German prisoners captured after the Normandy landings gave statements, later compiled by Allied interrogators, describing genuine disbelief at just how many of these things kept appearing. Not admiration exactly, something closer to dread. Because scarcity was the entire operating condition of the German army by that point in the war. Fuel was rationed by the liter. Tires were patched and repatched until there was nothing left to patch. And here was an enemy that didn't seem to understand the concept of scarcity at all. An enemy that could apparently just build another one, and another, and another, faster than anyone could keep count. That alone would have been unsettling enough. Production numbers can be dismissed as an abstraction, something you read in a report and try not to think about too hard. But then came the terrain, and terrain doesn't stay an abstraction for long. At just over 2,000 pounds, with a short wheelbase and genuine four-wheel drive, the Jeep could scramble up ground that stopped vehicles 3 times its size, dead in their tracks. German after-action reports from the mountains around Monte Cassino describe American forces pushing jeeps through passes that actual mule trains were struggling to cross. One paraphrased account, drawn from a captured transport officer's diary, describes watching a jeep climb a slope his own men had already written off as impossible for anything with wheels. He called it watching a machine cheat the laws of terrain. Here's where it gets strange, though. German engineers weren't just annoyed that the jeep could climb like that. They were unsettled by why it could. And that why comes back later in this story, in a place absolutely nobody in 1944 would have expected to find it. Quick pause here. If you're into the machines that quietly decided this war, not the tanks and the fighter planes, but the unglamorous logistics nobody puts on a movie poster, this channel is built entirely around stories like this one. Subscribe now, because what's coming next is where things get genuinely strange. One moment the Jeep showed up as a simple courier vehicle. The next, it was an ambulance. Then the same silhouette reappeared, with a .50 caliber Browning bolted to a pedestal mount in the back, capable of tearing through an advancing squad at over 400 rounds a minute. Sometimes it just towed a 37mm anti-tank gun behind it, like that was nothing at all. German patrol reports from the Normandy hedgerows repeatedly flagged Jeep-mounted gun teams as a persistent threat, specifically because you couldn't dismiss one on sight. It might be harmless, it might not be, and by the time you found out which, it had already moved past you. That unpredictability bred something close to real paranoia in units that prided themselves on reading a battlefield at a glance. You couldn't train a soldier to be suspicious of every single Jeep he saw, and still expect him to function normally in the field. And yet, that's exactly the state German patrols were operating in by the summer of 1944. And paranoia, it turns out, was only the beginning. Because captured letters and photographs recovered from American positions showed something German observers genuinely struggled to process. Soldiers naming their jeeps, painting nose art across the hoods, decorating them with unit mottos, like they were companions instead of equipment. To a military culture built on rigid discipline, that looked almost undisciplined, even a little embarrassing. But it pointed at something the Wehrmacht never fully understood about the men on the other side of that hedgerow. Soldiers who trusted a machine enough to personalize it were soldiers who believed that machine would actually bring them home. That trust wasn't sentimental. It was strategic, whether the men themselves realized it or not. And it's the very last piece you need before the big one. The detail this entire video has been quietly building towards since the first 10 seconds. Here it is. After the war ended, as a defeated West Germany rebuilt an army from scratch under the watchful eye of its former enemies, German engineers and Bundeswehr planners went looking for a template for their own new light military vehicle. And here's the part almost nobody mentions. They didn't reach back into their own wartime catalog at all. Military historians widely credit the light 4x4 utility vehicles that followed in post-war Germany. Machines like the DKW Munga, formally adopted by the newly formed Bundeswehr in the 1950s, withdrawing directly on the design logic that Allied Jeeps had already proven on German soil. Strip away everything that isn't essential. Standardize every part across every factory. Build for abuse, not for elegance. Sit with that for a second. The exact philosophy that German officers found almost insulting back in 1942. The wrench and wire simplicity, the interchangeable parts, the plain stamped panels, became the blueprint their own country's next generation of engineers were explicitly told to copy. Think about how strange that actually is. The same men who once wrote reports mocking the Jeep's flat panels and folding windshield were, a decade later, standing in front of their own new army, explaining why their next vehicle needed to look and function almost exactly like it. Not because anyone forced them to, because the battlefield had already settled the argument for them. The machine they mocked on sight, the one that looked like a joke next to their own precision-built Kübelwagen, became the standard they eventually built their entire post-war army around. That's not a footnote buried in a history book. That's arguably the real ending of who won the industrial argument of the Second World War. The Jeep never stormed a beach under its own power. It never fired the shot that ended anything. But it carried the men who did, through mud, through mountains, through roads that should have stopped it cold, over and over, hundreds of thousands of times, until even the men fighting against it couldn't help but notice. There's something almost quiet about that kind of victory. No headlines, no parades named after it, just a boxy little machine doing the same unglamorous job again and again until an entire enemy army was forced to admit, first in its own field reports and then in its own post-war factories, that the joke had actually been the answer all along. Sometimes the machine that wins a war isn't the one built to look powerful. It's the one built to never, ever quit. If stories like this one, the quiet machines that decided history without ever getting the credit, are your thing, there's a lot more of it waiting on this channel. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.